so the format of this workshop will be, at the end, there will be a Q&A, and you can put questions in the chat and they'll be asked at the end by our wonderful interviewer who is here, which is Zoe. And our presenters today are Jacob Kaufman. He is the founder of National Muffin Day and the Awesomeness Foundation Homelessness Chapter. And he's a lawyer at Google by day and an activist by night. And he is my cousin. And the other presenter today is Kevin Zwick, who is my uncle, and he is the CEO at wait, one second. One second, it's loading. He's the CEO of United Way, a 100-year-old nonprofit organization focused on breaking the cycle of poverty. And he was previously the CEO of Housing Trust Silicon Valley, a nonprofit organization focused on affordable housing in the Greater Bay Area for 12 years. And he's been involved in activism and local politics since high school and learned about community organizing while at UC Berkeley. And he lives in San Jose. And so just a few reminders about some future events that are coming up. Next Saturday is our action group. So if you find this workshop interesting or the topics discussed, then you can go to that and learn more about taking action for them, and you'll have support in doing that. And then on this next Sunday, there will be a muffin baking live stream on Instagram for National Muffin Day to raise awareness of homelessness. Okay, now we can have our presenters, and let me, wait. How do I allow you to screen share?
Are you, do you want me, am I going first? I'll go first. So let me, okay, host disabled participant screen share.
Okay, now you should be able to.
Okay, beautiful. All right, can everyone see my screen? It says homelessness in America. It's a PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Now it should be taking up the whole screen.
Yep.
Beautiful. Okay. I got 20 minutes. I'll try to keep it there. Hi, uh-oh. It's already a bad sign. All right, quick introduction about me. Well, Rebecca already said I'm a lawyer. I work at Google. I'm a Bay Area native. I live in, oh, it's not showing the pictures. All right, well, there should be a picture of my beautiful dog, Teddy, who's a Bichon Poodle mix. I enjoy baking muffins and distributing them to hungry folks. I'm the co-founder of National Muffin Day, which I'll tell you a little bit about. I'm also the dean of the Awesome Foundation Homelessness Chapter, and my zodiac sign is Cancer, in case that's important to you. All right, so I want to talk about, divide my 20 minutes into 4 things. One is just going to be some cold hard facts about homelessness in America, myths versus realities about homelessness, how we can help, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about National Muffin Day. I think one disclaimer I should give you is that I'm not a social worker. I'm not a nonprofit worker. I am not an expert in homelessness. I am a activist and enthusiast. So most of my information I give you comes from my looking at sources on the internet and otherwise. I'm not an expert in this field, but I know a lot from experience. Okay, here are some cold hard facts, and I'll explain where the source is about these afterwards. But the most recent kind of official statistics we have on people experiencing homelessness comes from January 2019, so 2 years ago. Obviously, due to COVID and people losing their jobs, homelessness may have increased since then. At the time, that we have, there were 715 people experiencing homelessness in America. Very quick note on terminology. A lot of people use the phrase homeless people. I prefer, and others in organizations prefer to use the phrase people experiencing homelessness to really highlight the fact that these are people first, and homelessness is a condition, hopefully temporary. Of the people experiencing homelessness in America, a little less than 400,000 are kind of individuals on their own, but then nearly 30% are families with children. Roughly 100,000 are chronically homeless, which means that they've been homeless for more than a year, and they also have some other disabling condition, like a physical disability, a mental disability, or substance addiction. Of the homeless population in America, roughly 60% are male, 40% are female. The statistic I got was that 1% are transgender or gender nonconforming. I think that percentage is probably a lot higher in San Francisco and the Bay Area. Roughly 37% are unsheltered, meaning sleeping on the streets and not in homeless shelters. And there are more individuals and families in that situation. There's a lot of racial disparity in homelessness. Pacific Islander and Native American are the populations that are most effective, at least from what we can tell from our statistics. Blacks, multiracial Americans, and Hispanics, Latinx are also disproportionately represented. California has by far the most people experiencing homelessness, roughly 151,000. New York is a distant second with 92,000. And I was listening to a podcast yesterday and learned a statistic that in the year 2021, 1 in 16 children will experience homelessness by the time they're 6 years old, which is, if you could imagine your grade school class having, 20, 25, 30 people, then it could be 1 or 2 of those students, which is crazy. The source of most of those statistics, except the podcast one, is what they call the point in time count. It's done by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The methodology is not great. They ask for volunteers and then send volunteers out with those hand counters. They send some into homeless shelters, and they send others just, take this block on the street, and just every time you see a person that you think is a person experiencing homelessness, click on a button. It's very inaccurate. It generally leads to undercounting, but almost any time you hear a statistic related to homelessness with actual numbers, for example, 8,011 people are experiencing homelessness in San Francisco, that's where this come from. It doesn't take into, it's not a great method. It doesn't take into account a lot of things. One major piece is a large swath of people experiencing homelessness are not sleeping in shelters or on the streets. Someone could be without a home and have a friend or a family member who lets them sleep on their couch or in their basement. They might have scrounged up enough money to sleep in a hotel that night. So I would take all of these numbers that you see with a grain of salt and assume the situation is probably a little worse. Okay, I'd like to talk about myths versus realities of homelessness. Myth 1. So there's obviously a lot of stigmatization and negativity towards people experiencing homelessness. There goes my dog. Well, you didn't see him, but you heard him, folks. So one common myth is that homeless people are lazy and don't want jobs. And you okay? Now I have to show him to you. Sorry. Teddy, say hi to the people. Say hi to the people. All right. Oh no, what's going on? So I use the term homeless people here because the type of person that's going to call a person experiencing homelessness lazy is probably going to call them a homeless person. So, there's a common, very unfortunate theme that someone who is experiencing homelessness is doing it because of their own sort of failing as a human being, and if they were just harder workers, they wouldn't be in this situation. The fact is, roughly 40 to 60% of people experiencing homelessness are employed, and the fact is, we're in a housing crisis nationwide where the amount of wages a person makes, even if they're working 40 hours a week, in a job that could even pay more than minimum wage, is simply not enough to afford rent. It's in the Bay Area and New York and other large cities and Los Angeles, the problem is exacerbated. I mean, in order to afford to live in San Francisco, for example, you have to make considerably more than minimum wage. Also, a lot of people who are experiencing homelessness have disabilities that make employment very difficult or impossible. There are, the government does provide disability checks, but those are usually not sufficient to cover housing expenses. And then the other reality that people don't take into account is that experiencing homelessness has a number of other effects that make it difficult to get a job. It's really hard to get a job if you don't have a address or a phone or internet access or a shower and a way to get haircuts and clean clothes if you need them for interviews or just talking to people. A lot of people who are experiencing homelessness get their government IDs stolen at one point. So, not having a driver's license or a state ID makes it very difficult to get a job. And also, it's really hard to go out looking for a job when your top priority is getting food for the night and taking care of your most basic needs. So people think that the order that you have to do is just get a job and then you'll get out of homelessness. But in reality, it's virtually impossible to get a decent job while you are experiencing homelessness. Myth number 2, people are homeless because they want to be. Especially with homeless youth, there's a notion that they're just trying to be rebellious. They're just doing it for fun. They're just doing it for attention. The reality is being homeless is harsh. It's dangerous. It's very frightening. It's unsafe. It's degrading and it's unhealthy. And no one really wants to experience homelessness. The real reason people become homeless is because they lose their homes. A lot of people are evicted, which can happen if you fail to pay the rent just once even. And this can happen if you suddenly lose your job, if you're laid off, if you have a sudden or unexpected medical expense, if you have a disability. With respect to youth who are homeless, a lot of youth are forced to become homeless because their situation at home is not safe. I know in San Francisco, a little less than 50% of youth experiencing homelessness are LGBT, and often come from places where their parents will not accept that and will act violently towards them. So they have to determine that living on the streets is the better option, which is horrible. Myth number 3: homeless people are dangerous, violent criminals. This is all part of kind of a dehumanization campaign. That the truth is that being homeless makes you more likely to be a victim of violent crime, whether from other people stealing from you, whether experiencing violence from the police. It is true that homeless people commit more crimes, but I use my air quotes because the crimes are, a lot of municipalities and cities make homelessness criminal. For example, if you have a law against sleeping on benches, well, the people who are going to have to sleep on benches are people experiencing homelessness. There's a quote by a French author that I think sums it up, which is, "The law, in all its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread." Obviously, these are laws that are only going to affect people without assets. Final myth is there's nothing I can do to help people experiencing homelessness, and that is simply not true. There is a lot that we can do to help, and that segues into what can we do? The answer is a lot. So number one is, building understanding. What do people experiencing homelessness want and need? Honestly, it's the same things as you and I, for real. People experiencing homelessness want to be seen. In all my time outreach activity, the number one complaint is that people who are experiencing homelessness are made to feel like they're invisible. A lot of people, when you walk down the street, you don't want to acknowledge or see people experiencing homelessness. People put on kind of blinders, and it's an act of protection, but it really is dehumanizing to these people. Another is to be heard. Everybody wants to be able to be understood and have their grievances aired and have their needs met. And a lot of times people experiencing homelessness are shut off and have no advocacy. Clean socks and other hygienic materials. I have spoken with nurses and other healthcare professionals who provide services for people experiencing homelessness, and they say the number one thing people experiencing homelessness need most to stay healthy is clean socks. If you are barefoot in the streets, it's extremely dangerous with all the germs and bacteria that can go to your feet. But also toothbrushes, toothpaste, soap, shampoo, tampons, other hygienic materials are all things people can use. Hot showers, because it's not something that's easily accessible. Food, and when I say food, I mean good food. I think, there are, especially in San Francisco, a lot of opportunities for homeless people to be fed and not starve to death. But food in certain areas is the food that you get from soup kitchens or food that you get from 7-Eleven or McDonald's is not good and not healthy. Kindness, of course, everyone likes to be treated kindly. You would be surprised how much a smile and acknowledgement helps. It's greatly appreciated by all human beings, and a lot of people experiencing homelessness, go days without having another human being look at them or smile at them and talk to them, and that's a horrible feeling. And that relates to the last one, which is dignity, just being treated as human beings. I will give a little shameless plug here. I'm doing an Ask Me Anything with a amazing unhoused woman who I met last week named Elizabeth, who can answer questions from the experience of a person experiencing homelessness. And I can definitely give information. Maybe Rebecca, we can do send a follow-up email to the participants where I can give the registration for that. It's going to be a great event. I know there's a lot going on. There's also Rebecca's action that same day. Don't want to intrude on that, but something to think about. Okay, volunteering. So there's, by the way, this is the only time in my life I will ever use a GIF featuring Taylor Swift. I'm really proud of myself for being culturally relevant. There's a lot of ways to volunteer. Food banks, shelters, I've done things where they get old clothes. People donate clothes, but they need to be folded or put on racks or separated. A lot of local agencies, no matter where you are, if you Google homeless organization in the name of your town, you'll find something. There's also political campaigns that happen frequently. Certainly locally in San Francisco, I've participated in several proposition campaigns to benefit people experiencing homelessness. Donating. So all of these places need money. I know a lot of people and youth are students. You would be, without large discretionary incomes, you would be surprised at how a little money can go a very long way. $10 can provide 5 or 6 meals. $100 can provide a pair of glasses. There's $20 can provide a 6-pack of socks. There's so much that you can do with a little money. My saying on donations is the key is to understand that to get yourself in the headspace where donating $50 feels better than buying a new pair of jeans. And I can honestly say I've had the same pair of jeans for like 7 years and I feel great. So There are a lot of places to donate. My favorites, there's an organization called Family Promise that is national. They have programs for homeless families. Pets of the Homeless is exactly what it sounds like. So many people experiencing homelessness have dogs and cats, and that they really rely on for companionship. And these animals need to be fed and have emergency veterinary services, etc. Project Homeless Connect is local to San Francisco. They provide a ton of much needed resources, including government IDs, which I talked about. And another one of my favorites, it's all over Northern California, is called Downtown Streets Team. They give people jobs, cleaning up, picking up trash, and they help with housing and job placement, and they just do incredible work. They truly save lives. Giving food or handing out other, I should also mention handing out socks or toothbrushes, soap, shampoo. People form blessing bags with different things in them. I love this, and giving out food is how I got started with my homelessness outreach. I would bake muffins and hand them out to people experiencing homelessness. I think during COVID times, I would say probably don't hold off on this. I would not want anyone to get COVID. I would not want anyone to transmit COVID. I will say that COVID is going to be over soon. I swear this slide is meant, just remember this slide next year. It really is a great way to help. I think another thing about people experiencing homelessness often receive food that's just not that great. I bake muffins because I think they taste really darn good, and they're homemade. And oftentimes people, will say that they haven't gotten a really good homemade food in a long time. It shows that you care. It shows that I'm taking time to make something for you because I care about you as a human. And also handing things out is a great way to interact and talk to people and meet people. So that brings me to National Muffin Day. It started 6 years ago. It's a holiday that I invented where I try to get as many folks as possible to bake muffins and hand them out to people experiencing homelessness. I encourage people to take pictures and post on social media with the hashtag #GiveMuffins. And for every person who does that, I donate to Family Promise and Project Homeless Connect. I've raised $40,000 to date. It's a lot of fun. This year it's happening next Sunday. It's a little different because of COVID, and I'm encouraging people to not hand out muffins. But we can bake muffins for your family or your podmates or your neighbors or yourself. Take a picture and post with hashtag #GiveMuffins. And for everyone who does that, and then also donate. I'm encouraging people to donate $12 to represent a dozen muffins to any charity. For every person who does that, I will donate money to Family Promise and Project Homeless Connect. And if you're wondering if you want to participate with other people, Rebecca and the organization is hosting a baking party at 3 p.m. on Instagram Live next Sunday. Encourage you all to be there. I will definitely try to make an appearance, and we can have fun baking. And Rebecca, do you know what kind of muffins you're going to be baking?
Banana chocolate chip ones, but they're going to be vegan.
Vegan banana chocolate. Well, banana chocolate chip is my favorite flavor of muffin. Vegan well, I used to poo-poo vegan muffins, but I will say that Samia actually makes really excellent vegan muffins, which she made for me when I was visiting her in New Mexico. So I'm sure yours will be delicious also. I think I managed to nail it down in 20 minutes. So now I know we're actually going to do questions afterwards. So I will stop my sharing and pass over to Kevin.
Thanks, Jacob. That was a great presentation, and I was today next week as well. And we'll definitely send something out and share that. That's awesome that you started that, Jacob. So here, let me share my screen. Start from the beginning. Let's see. All right, do you guys see a very boring slide, white on black? All right, great. Well, thanks. So Rebecca asked me to focus on if I could talk about housing needs in the Bay Area, and touching on disparities and inequity in the housing crisis in the Bay Area. So that's what I'm going to do. We'll first talk about how COVID-19 and the challenges we're having right now is making worse the housing crisis. Then we'll talk a little bit about how the housing crisis isn't felt the same way among all people, that there are real racial disparities and racial inequities to the affordable housing crisis. And then we'll talk a little bit about the lack of affordable housing, why some of the historical reasons why we see these racial disparities in housing. And then finally, a few things that you can do, a few things we all can do. So first, to give some idea, sometimes we use percentages, 12% this, 14% that, and I think people don't get a real sense of how many people it is that we're talking about. So just in San Francisco, Oakland, and Berkeley, so maybe a third of the Bay Area, there's over 1 million renters over the age of 18 in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley metropolitan area. Right now, this is a survey that the census does every few months. It's called a pulse survey. So right now, of those 1.1 million renters, more than 330,000 of them say they don't have any confidence in their ability to pay next month's rent because of how bad the economy is for people. And then of those, more than 56,000 renters think it's probably really likely that they're going to get evicted next month. These numbers are off the charts high versus in a normal year, it might be 5,000, 10,000. Right now, it's, there's currently 56,000 people who think I might get evicted in the next month. When we look and say like, well, but is that the same thing that's happening everywhere? In this first line is around what we just talked about. 12% of all renters aren't caught up on their rent payments. 13% locally think they don't have any ability to pay their rent next month, and then are worried about getting evicted in the next 2 months, almost a quarter of all renters. Now, compared to the rest of the country, a lot less people compared to the country. I mean, in the country, 1 in 5 renters aren't caught up on their rent payments. They have back rent that's due. And so we're doing a little bit better. So people here locally, they're like, compared to the rest of the country, people are figuring out how to pay their rent this month. Don't really know how they're going to pay it next month. And here, people are a lot more worried about being evicted than the rest of California and the United States. So when we start to break down, is everybody in this together? Is everybody experiencing the same way? It's not the case. So these numbers are, again, still in California. It's not nationwide, but the bars that you want to look at here are these gray bars, which say who's falling behind in rent the most. And in California, it's Latinx families. They're more than 3 times more likely than white families to be behind in rent. They're also the most worried about thinking, are they going to be able to pay their rent next month? So this blue bar is people who are like, no, yeah, I got it. I got rent next month. And the yellow bar is, yeah, I probably have rent that's paid for next month. So among white families, it's nearly 90%, but among Hispanic and Latinx families, they have the smallest blue bar of any of the racial groups. The other way that this is affecting everyone right now and that everyone's not in the same boat is when you look at everybody split up by income. And some of this might be like common sense, but it is really, I always find it really shocking when I see the data behind it that, you know, if you're making more than $100,000 a year, you're sure you're paying rent. So you're just not in the same level of worry as folks who make less than $50,000 a year or less than $35,000 a year. Folks are incredibly worried that they're not going to be making rent. So a lot of people are worried right now around COVID, around other things. But you know, if you're making more than $50,000, $75,000, one of your worries isn't making rent. But there's a whole lot of people in our community that don't make that much, and they're really worried right now about being able to make rent. So, you know, obviously, you know, COVID-19 and what's happening right now in the economy is bad, but even before that, we had a housing crisis. So, so everything that's happening now is on top of this other challenge that we had where, so one of the things in my world, and I've been working in affordable housing for more than 20 years, is a measure that we use to see if someone's doing okay or if they're paying too much for their rent, and that's a problem, is this term called rent burden, which means you shouldn't be paying more than a third of your income on rent, on your housing. If you are, that's a problem. If you're paying more than half of your income on rent, it's a really big problem because that means you don't have enough money to pay for everything else you need: food, your car, your clothes, saving a little money for a rainy day. So we're one of the things that we're always concerned about is who's paying more than a third of their income on rent, and then really concerned about people who are paying more than half of all of their income on rent. And there were a lot of people in California. Half of all people who rent an apartment are in this burdened measurement. So, you know, that was what it was like a year ago, the good old days. And now with COVID-19 and so many people still out of work, it's even worse. To bring it again forward about, well, why are we focused so much on rent instead of maybe people who own their homes? Well, we see the racial disparities when we're looking at who is it that is living in renter households. So an organization like United Way, and at my old organization at Housing Trust, we care a lot about the fact that there is a lot of policies and laws and history that have made it really, really hard for Black families and for Latinx families and for immigrant families to have housing that they can afford. And I'll talk about some of them a little later. So because of that, then we have to think about, well, what is it that we should be doing? Should we be spending more time helping the people that historically have had the most challenges and the most discrimination? So we believe we should. If we're being an anti-racist organization, then we have to make actions that are correcting past racial and racist policies. So for us, we need to figure out, okay, well then where can we be doing the most to correct past racial wrongs? And so that's why we break things out by race. And so we see more, 58% of all Black households are renting. That's compared to 34% of all white households are renting. So that makes us think like, okay, well then we should really be looking at what we can to help renter households. And then, this slide over here, this graph over here shows how many children by race are living in families right now where their parents are having trouble affording their housing, being rent burdened or incredibly rent burdened. So more than 2/3 of Black children in California are in households where their families are paying unaffordable rents. And then look by age group or by racial group, it's really different between white and Black families. And I thought of this when I heard Jacob say that, 1 in 16 children across the country experience homelessness. The step right before being homeless, a lot of times, is when a family can't afford their rent, is paying way too much for their rent. And so this shows, of those 1 in 16 kids that might become homeless, the likelihood is that it's going to be a child in a Black family or a Latinx family too. And it sort of says, why do we have racial disparities? Why are Black and Latinx families overrepresented among those who are homeless? Well, it's because they're the most likely to be living in housing that's unaffordable. Then, so a real challenge to this is there's not enough places that are affordable apartments. So there's no state in the country that has an adequate supply of apartments that are affordable for the lowest income individuals to rent. I mean, in some places it's really bad. Here in California, there's less than 30 apartments for every 100 renters who make less than $30,000 a year. So, and I wish there was a state somewhere where there was at least enough housing for people, for everyone, but that's not the case. It's just here in the West Coast, it's really, really bad. Here in the Bay Area, sometimes people have asked me, like, do we know how much affordable housing we need to build in order to make it better? And we actually do. So in the Bay Area, the gap is 235,000 homes. So there's over 450,000 renter households that make less than $50,000 a year, but there's only 190,000 apartments that rent at a level that a very low income household could afford. So we actually know exactly how many more apartments are needed throughout the Bay Area to balance that. And it's not just really low income families. I don't know if you can see this part. I'm sort of blocking it with my videos over here, but when you look at teachers, so teachers in Alameda, Marin, Napa, San Francisco, no teacher, there's no average teacher salary anywhere in the Bay Area that's where people are earning enough to afford their rent. So in Alameda, a teacher would need to be earning $8,600 a month in order to afford rent. Marin, $10,000, San Francisco, $15,000. But in reality, teachers on average are earning $3,300 a month. So what can be done? Well, we need to build a lot more affordable housing, and it's, there's a challenge to building affordable housing, is that for the most part, people don't want affordable housing near themselves. They don't want apartment buildings. So this was just from a few months ago here in Castro Valley. I think some of you guys live in Castro Valley. A nonprofit organization in Eden Housing has been trying to build a 72-unit apartment building on 6 acres of vacant land near A Street and Ruby Street. Maybe you guys know where that is. I think I kind of know where it is. It's kind of near Hayward, border between Hayward and Castro Valley. But people can think of lots and lots of reasons not to build an apartment if it's going to go for low income. Even good reasons like, hey, this is open space and we need more open space. So some of those are like perfectly legitimate reasons. A lot of times it's not. A lot of times people say things like, this will change the character of my neighborhood, or I'm afraid affordable housing means that it's going to bring crime, or the value of my home is going to go down. And those are just not true. So it's really hard. This nonprofit organization, it's taken them 6 or 7 years just to get to this point of the Castro Valley officials. I think it was the County Board of Supervisors, to allow them to approve building 72 units, because it's, again, neighbors come out, interest groups come out. Other times, perfectly good groups we all like environmental groups, come out and say, we like affordable housing, but just not here. There's always just not here. So it's really hard to get affordable housing built. So you would think if it's, if this is such a big problem in the country, there's not enough rental housing. Well, I bet the federal government is on it. I bet they're focusing their attention on helping create more housing. And the truth is, we don't. We spend very little money nationally on creating more affordable housing. We spend a ton of money on helping people buy homes. Now that sounds like a good thing, except when you think about who's the most in need. So in America, anybody who wants one, up to people having $1 million mortgages, can get a subsidy, can get the federal government to help them pay their mortgage. And not every renter who needs help gets help at all. We spend more than 3 times the amount of money helping anybody buy a home who wants one than we do helping the millions and millions and millions of people who need to afford their rent. And as a result, we spend as a country more money on people whose income is over $200,000 than we do the 50 million people who earn less than $50,000. So there's a big imbalance around where the problems are and where we as a country focus our attention. And then, that leads to some of the, main racial disparities in housing, which is this idea that after generations of supporting people being homeowners, not supporting people who are renters, and then having a lot of discriminatory policies around who we help become a homeowner, we're left with a situation today where a typical white family in America has 10 times the amount of wealth than a Black family. So this is from 2016. You can see at no time have we ever been close as a country, but this is going in the wrong, in the greater direction. And other studies have shown that the gap is only getting bigger. And there's, when I say there's historical reasons why that's the case, there is. So it was only in 1968 that we passed a law that said, called the Fair Housing Act, that said it's against the law to discriminate against renting or buying a home for Black families. And that's not that long ago. So that has impacts today. So there was this policy called redlining, which meant that the government had a policy to discourage banks from giving loans to people who lived in Black neighborhoods. So this is a map of Oakland and Berkeley and Alameda from earlier in the century, or last century. And all of these red areas meant that you weren't allowed to get a bank loan, or the government wouldn't support a bank making a loan in those areas. And the yellow loans, it was really, really hard. The blue areas and the green areas go right ahead. Well, when you go back in time, these were the neighborhoods where Black people mostly lived, versus the green and blue areas, which were predominantly white families. So it was another way that decisions were made by the government to say, how do we keep people segregated? And the result today is, white families are much more likely to own a home than Black families. So let's get to some solutions. That was a lot of history and information, but the number one solution to the housing crisis is we have to build more homes everywhere for everyone. But we don't want to tear down the apartments where low-income people currently live to do it. Another solution is there's a lot of malls everywhere. There's a lot of land that's not used really efficiently, especially around BART and Caltrain. And that's the places where we should put a lot of apartments and shopping together in bigger buildings. We also should allow people to build a tiny home in their backyard or two, and rent it to somebody who needs it, a grandparent, a college student, a friend, or just somebody who needs an affordable place to rent. Something we all can do is support affordable housing when it's proposed in our city, especially when other neighbors and other residents are angry about it. And then finally, some things that we're trying to do at United Way is to stop the government from subsidizing rich people buying a second home before Black, Latinx, and other people have a chance to buy their first home. And then finally, we just need to do whatever we can to stop extreme rent increases and keep people from being evicted from their homes. So this one is, there's a lot of like things you can do around petitions. You can do things around when there's something coming to the Alameda County Board of Supervisors or the Castro Valley Town Council, to coming out and being people who say, yes, we want to do something about the housing crisis. Yes, we want to support housing. And with that, I will turn it back to you, Rebecca.
Awesome. Thank you guys for your presentations. Now we'll move on to our Q&A portion. So if you have any questions regarding the presentations or just about the issues in general, you can type them in the chat, and Zoe will read them and she'll ask some other questions as well. So Zoe, you can ask questions or get them from the chat.
For sure. Thanks, Rebecca. So while people are like putting their questions in the chat, I think one thing that stood out to me, Kevin, you were talking about eviction and like tenants' rights a little bit. And I was wondering like how has the relationship between tenants and landlords shifted due to the pandemic and due to economic stability, so like that relationship?
That's a really great question. It's something that's really, really important right now. So the worst thing that could happen right now is for people to lose their homes. How could you be safe and shelter in a safe place if you didn't have a home right now during COVID? So there's been a recognition of that, and there's been essentially what's called a moratorium, meaning the government has said no landlords can evict tenants right now if they can't pay their rent while COVID is still a problem. And the problem is they say, well, let's do it for 3 months, and then 3 months come up and we're still in a problem. So we got to get longer and longer and longer. But one of the things with the new president and his administration is they've extended the moratorium out another 6 months, and they're doing something even better, which is they're sending hundreds of billions of dollars to states, which are now distributing it locally to counties to help people make up the rent that they haven't been able to pay, so that when the eviction moratorium ends, landlords won't be able to say, well, you didn't pay me the rent in the past few months, so now I'm going to evict you. There's going to be money coming so that tenants can make up the rent that they owe their landlords. And then in exchange, the landlord can't evict them. So and then that's on top of other things that are happening in California, where California's passed some good laws to make it more difficult for landlords to evict people if they can't pay right now. Because the number one thing that keeps people in poverty, or why people fall into poverty and they can't get out, is once you get an eviction on your record, it makes it extremely harder to find another apartment. So if we're trying to find those things that we could do to keep people from falling into poverty or to help get them out of poverty, we should stop whatever we can to stop people being evicted and having that on their records. Good question, Zoe.
Thank you. So like there's this kind of flow from like national, state, and local trying to tackle this problem. That's great.
Yeah, and it's different. It hasn't been that way just in the last month or so with the new administration. Up until now, cities have been trying to figure this out on their own, counties, nonprofit organizations, in the state of California. But the only place that really has the money that can do this is the federal government. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that now. And it's like help is finally on its way.
Yeah, That's great. Oh, and Jacob has a question in the chat. He says, I have a question for Kevin. You mentioned tearing down low-income apartments to build new homes, likely less affordable. I know this happened a lot in the 50s and 60s with urban renewal. Is this still going on?
No, it's not going on at the level that it was in the 50s and 60s, but it is still happening. And so there was this big push finally to say, like, look, we got to build really tall, really dense housing near transit in the cities. And that was a good thing. And then people didn't realize, oh, that's displacing people who live there now, even if sometimes even if you don't tear down the building, but you just build a really big new luxury housing next door, market forces then maybe force the lower income building, the older building, it forces up their rents too. So right now, this is a big battle in the state of California. How do we balance those two things out? How do we add the most housing near transit, because that's the best thing for our climate crisis. Getting people to use public transportation instead of cars will do so much to help improve our environment. But how do you do it in such a way that everyone just builds luxury housing, and then all of a sudden lower income people can't afford their apartments nearby? So they're trying to craft that balance. And I would say it still does happen here in San Jose. People are buying old 2-story apartment buildings and knocking them down to build larger housing that's more expensive. And there's not anything that keeps them from doing it.
Definitely. Before I get to Leah and Sarah's question, I just wanted to do a follow-up question about, because I think something that I was thinking about is the idea of gentrification, and the way like it talks about like building luxury homes and then the people around them can't afford their places they live in. So do you think that like gentrification is something that's inevitable? Is something that's necessary for like the economy to grow? Or do you think that it's not sustainable? Or is there like a way to sort of like balance those two push and pull elements?
Yeah, it's not necessary in order to help lift everybody up, but if you don't have policies in place, it does become inevitable. So it's the way, yeah, it's one of the things that people are really focused on. I mean, we want to keep everybody here. It's really important for families who have lived in the area their generations to not be forced to move farther and farther away to find an affordable place to live. And that is what's happening. That's sort of what causes gentrification. So it doesn't have to be that way. There's a policy that we're trying to put in place that says when you build one of these new affordable apartment complexes, you should give preference to the low-income people that were already living in the area. And as opposed to just letting anyone move in, and then lo and behold, the Latinx or the Black families that were in the area didn't get a chance to get into that good housing and have to move away. And that goes up against some laws that say you can't give out housing based off of race or based off of who used to live in the area. So it's really difficult, but a lot of smart people are trying their best to think about gentrification as we're trying to come up with good housing policies. But it's tough. It's a good question.
Thanks for answering. And so for Leah's and Sarah's question, how much, and I guess this could be directed to both Jacob and Kevin perhaps, but how much can programs for foster children help?
Jacob, you want to say anything about that?
I was on mute. Yeah, so again, I'm not an expert working in this space, but I have I've interacted with people who are. So the answer is certainly a lot, but with two major caveats. So foster youth programs are for people under the age of 18 who have, are without families, in some cases have run away from families, and are able to get them placed with families who can support them. It, in theory, is a great program. It's certainly better for someone to be, for a young person to be with a family, a caring family, more than sleeping on the streets. There are two issues in practice with foster care that are unfortunate. One is there are, the government pays a stipend to families to take in foster kids, and there are some people who abuse that by taking foster kids and ignoring them, or even abusing them while getting the money from the government. Fortunately, that's not a major problem, but it is a problem that exists, and because it is widely known among the homeless, the homeless youth community, the community of youth experiencing homelessness, it does create distrust in the system. This is an example of bad apples, of a few bad apples hurting the system. A bigger problem that foster youth face is, a lot of times there's, the foster youth program goes until you're 18, and then you're cut off from it. It's the arbitrary age where at 18 you're an adult now, so you don't need the support. The truth is, in American society, having support is often needed past the age of 18. Helping to pay for college or pay for things in college, even if you get scholarship, being able to go, I'm a lawyer now, but when I was studying for the bar exam, when I was unemployed and didn't have money, I was able to live with my parents again for a few months, when I was almost 30. I mean, there's a lot of support most people are going to need to really thrive after the age of 18. And also, oftentimes in the foster program, your schooling situation is suspect. Oftentimes, you are a year or two behind. So when you're 18, you still haven't graduated from school, or, you just don't have life skill, the life skills needed to be an adult once you graduate from foster care. There are some great organizations dealing with that. One that comes to mind for me is this one, First Place for Youth, which I just put in the chat. I believe that they are based in Oakland, but they're really dedicated to helping, doing advocacy for people in foster care, and doing help to for people transitioning out of foster care. And I just went to their page, and it does come up on the very first page that, similar to and related to the housing equity concerns that Kevin was talking about, there's certainly equity concerns in the foster care system. There's, minorities are definitely represented disproportionately, and also might have a difficult time finding a more difficult time finding foster parents based on existing, prejudices, and a more difficult time with the system.
Thank you, Jacob. And I think Samia has something to add. So
yeah, I just wanted to add, if it's okay, since I am the social worker on here. So I don't, the question is very broad as far as the foster system and how can it impact. But going back to, when you're first talking about the majority of, or many homeless young people are identify as LGBTQI. And so when you're looking at foster families, you have the same challenges for a lot of these young people, especially trans and gender nonconforming kids, that you have with their biological families, where you have to be very careful about where you're placing young people, because they may be walking into a situation that's just as dangerous for them as the one they left. And so it's complex, because you don't necessarily know where you're going to end up. The other challenge in the foster care system for young people is that most people want a foster care child that is a baby or a cute little 5-year-old. They don't want teenagers. the older a young person is, the more trauma they usually have in the foster care system, and therefore the more behavioral issues, the more emotional stuff going on. And a lot of families are like, oh, I want the cute little babies who haven't been through as much trauma yet, and therefore don't have as much going on and aren't acting out and are easier to take on. And so those are things that play in to the foster care system having an impact in this context. So I just wanted to add that, if that's okay. I have a question, if we're not too far over time, and it's actually for Kevin. I'm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Santa Fe is disproportionately more expensive than the rest of the state, but still nothing compared to the Bay Area. But of course, we're one of the places where the exodus from there is happening. And one of the things that we have a huge affordable housing problem here and a shortage here. And one of the things that is, and just because you know more about housing, and this may or may not be within the area that you can speak to, but one of the things here is that we have these huge apartment complexes that they're putting up and developments going up because, and there's a percentage of all development is supposed to be affordable housing, but the way around it is that the developers are allowed to pay a fine to the city, to the housing trust, to get around to having affordable housing. And instead they just pay this fine, and we have the housing trust, which is supposed to help people with affordable housing. However, it's just not enough. And every developer pays it. So inevitably you don't get affordable housing. What is a better solution to this? Because it's clearly not working. And I'm assuming other cities have the same design, and it's not working here. And I'm sure it's not working other places. How do we work around it to shift it so that affordable housing isn't just gotten rid of?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's sort of when you create a policy and it has an unintended consequence. And then, so some cities have figured out, I'll say this. I've worked with a lot of real estate developers who are market rate developers, even people who, we'll call luxury housing developers. They will, build in the affordable housing, or they will do whatever is the easiest way to get them to build their housing. So if the and I've seen cities use the requirement to add affordable units as a way maybe to keep any housing from getting built. So there's sort of bad actors sometimes on both sides. And the trick is to find that middle ground where, a city can have usually one of two goals. One is they want housing, affordable homes built today. And if it means taking 10% of a building versus 20% of the building, they'll take it because they want the housing to get built soon, versus other places that are like, no, we know it takes longer to build 100% affordable development. Well, we want to do that because we want these homes, these affordable homes owned by nonprofit organizations and kept affordable for 100 years. So we would rather get these luxury developers to pay us fees so we can, even though it's going to take longer and we're not going to get the 10% of the homes that the luxury builder is going to build next year, it's going to take 5 years, but we'll get 100 homes if we just accumulate that money and then help a nonprofit build. They'll go in that direction. And a good city will have sort of multiple tools in their toolbox and calibrate between them, go from one to the other and try to fix so that if the public is organized and saying, whichever one you do, city, just make it work. Like, as long as they're getting pressure from people who care and low-income communities who are organized, to say, choose one or the other, choose both, but we're going to hold you accountable to building housing in the time frame that you say it is, then it's okay to have these different policies. Where it's bad is where I've seen people, where I've seen local cities who just don't want any housing because there's what's called NIMBYs, people who say, not in my backyard. And it's a very powerful force. They'll say, well, all these people are going to get mad at me if I build housing, but I know I look like a jerk if I say I don't want affordable housing. So I have the solution. I will make every regular apartment builder build half of their units affordable. and then lo and behold, that you can't do it. It just the developer can't make enough money on their building to make half of the units affordable, so nothing gets built. And then those local politicians say, well, what can you do? I clearly care about low-income housing because I was making that affordable developer make half of their units affordable. But oh well, you can't say I'm against poor people. And so they use these policies to sort of manipulate the outcome. So it's not a simple answer. One thing we do in San Jose is we say, let's create this policy, but you also have to have an economic study that's just the one who says what's feasible and what's not, and then go by that economic study. And so then it just makes it that much more difficult for either the developers to say, I can't do it, or the politicians to say, we don't know how to craft a good policy.
Kevin, can I ask you really quickly about the last point? So because I had heard that about the way things work, but I heard it through, now I have an expert. So in San Francisco, there are there are laws or ordinances that new buildings built in certain areas have to have X%, 20 to 30% affordable housing. But from what I understand, the penalty for failing to do that is a fine, which building owners and landlords can just pass on to the wealthier people living in the building. So it ends up, and people will still be willing to pay it because there's a lot of money amongst there. So ultimately, people, even though there's this law, simply refuse to follow it, and it results in there not actually being affordable housing.
It's not quite a fine, and it's not quite like you have to do it this way, and if you don't, we'll fine you. Actually, the way that cities set things up is they give people two options. You can either build your building and set aside 10 or 20% of the apartments to be affordable, or we'll let you up front pay a fee that should mitigate the cost, that should be comparable to the value of those 10 or 20 units. And you can just pay that fee up front. And it's that idea that cities want to have a balance. Sometimes they just want units right away, but other times they want to get that money and invest it with a nonprofit to have another building somewhere else that's all affordable and owned by a nonprofit. And if it's serving homeless people, giving them supportive services and all the like. And it's not the case. If a developer ever said, I'd give you those 20% of the units, and then I built my building, then I'm not going to do it. I'm really not going to do it. The city would have a right to not let that owner let anybody live in their building. That would be against the law, and it wouldn't be a fine. They would get shut down, and they would lose the ability to have people live in their building. So it's more the case. It happens at the beginning of a process where a developer can choose one or the other. And some people have honest feelings like, no, it's better. We just need all the units as fast as possible. So let's take 10% of every building. Other people say, no, let's make developers pay money so that the city can give it to a nonprofit so that we can build housing for the lowest income people or homeless individuals or individuals experiencing homelessness. And because those buildings, a person experiencing homelessness doesn't just need an apartment, it needs supportive services to go along with it. And those are best done by nonprofits who are building apartment buildings specifically for it. So it's just, it's complicated. It's a policy trade-off. But that I think is more of what's happening.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, that was great. Thank you guys so much for coming. And before you leave, in the chat, there's a form that I'd really appreciate if everyone on this call could fill out. Like if there's 2 people on your computer, then have both of them fill it out. Reminder, next week at 11 a.m. on Saturday, there will be an action group if you want to take action and have support in that. And then on Sunday at 3 p.m., there's the Muffin baking live if you want to come to that. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to stay on and be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great job, Becca.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.